I'm Jay Bryson, Chief Economist of the Corporate and Investment Bank at Wells Fargo, and I'm joined today by my colleague, international economist Brendan McKenna. So, Brendan, earlier this week, there was a lot of volatility in U.S. financial markets, and the story seems to be about this company in China called Evergrande that was having some sort of problems. Can you kind of level set here for us? Can you kind of walk us through and tell us, who Evergrande is and why it's a potential issue?
Sure. So Evergrande is actually one of the largest property developers in China. In fact, if you were to measure purely by assets, Evergrande would be the largest property developer in China. And actually, not too long ago, just back in 2018, Evergrande was the most valuable property developer in the world by market cap. And when you think about some of the underlying drivers of China's economy over, call it the last decade or so, real estate development has been a pretty important factor, and Evergrande has been right at the heart of that expansion. But over time, Evergrande strayed away from real estate and property development. They started making investments into electric vehicles, sports teams, sports leagues, really industries and sectors that didn't have a whole lot to do with real estate or property development. And in order to fund that expansion and fund some of these new operations, Evergrande took on a significant amount of debt. And those liabilities have accumulated to well over $300 billion. And these liabilities are starting to become an issue today amid China's push for common prosperity. And common prosperity really means spreading the wealth of the nation across the entire country. It also means reducing the cost of living. And when you think about reducing the cost of living, the cost of purchasing a home or renting an apartment, whatever it may be, is right at the top of that list. So as the government has tried to reduce home prices and reduce rental prices, Evergrande has really struggled to generate sufficient cash flow. And as the company struggled to generate sufficient cash flow, there's been some concerns that Evergrande may not be able to repay its bondholders, and that maybe a default or a bankruptcy could be on the horizon for Evergrande. And those concerns really boiled over into financial markets over the last week or so. We saw some pretty significant sell-offs in the equity markets and also in the high-yield corporate bond sector. And when you kind of think about, is this problem going away? The answer is really no. Evergrande has about $670 million worth of bond and interest payments that it needs to make before the end of this year. And the other challenge is that a lot of those bond payments are denominated in US dollars. So that adds another type of challenge that Evergrande needs to overcome. So like I said, Evergrande is having a bit of a financial crunch. Markets are starting to become worried about a bankruptcy or maybe a default. And kind of given the sheer size of Evergrande, market participants are starting to worry about if there's going to be any spillover into the Chinese economy, or if these effects are going to have any contagion effects on the global economy.
Okay, well, thank you for that explanation, but I still don't get it in some sense, right? Okay, this is a Chinese company, albeit it's a big one, but still, it's a Chinese company. What's the general issue here? Is there a bigger problem than just Evergrande?
So I don't necessarily think Evergrande is an isolated issue. I do think there could be some other large property developers within China that are having similar financial troubles. And there may even be some other companies outside of the real estate sector that could also be having some financial difficulties as well. I think maybe the Evergrande situation that's kind of materializing now could just be the tip of the iceberg. So, one way to kind of assess if this is a larger problem or not is to actually look at corporate debt within the country. And if you're looking at debt within the non-financial corporate sector, it's actually quite elevated within China. So as of this year, corporate debt in China is worth about 160% of GDP. And when you're thinking about the trajectory and how that number has evolved, just back in 2006, we were looking at corporate debt in China worth a little over 100% of GDP. So a pretty sharp increase. And to kind of put those numbers in a little bit of context, if you were to look at the corporate debt sector in the United States, corporate debt is worth around 85% of GDP this year. And again, over the course of the last 15 years or so, back in 2006, the corporate debt was worth about 60% of GDP. So just from the comparison to the United States, you can kind of see how big a debt problem China has within its corporate sector. I would say there is one key difference, though, and that big difference is most of the debt within China is held onshore. So a lot of the major US banks don't have a ton of exposure to some of these corporates within China, and certainly not a ton of exposure to Evergrande. You asked the question of whether this could be a potential issue. As of right now, we think the corporate debt problem within China is manageable. We think there are a bunch of backstops that the government could employ and the People's Bank of China could also employ to kind of manage and weather the issue. But again, the exposures to China's corporate debt sector outside of China are relatively limited. But I want to turn it back over to you, Jay, and I want to ask the question of, well, what if we're wrong? What if the corporate debt sector problems in China are a big issue and they are a little bit more systemic and there is more contagion than we expect? Is the U.S. economy at any type of economic risk from kind of a corporate debt sector blow up within China?
Yeah, or moreover, if Evergrande, as you just pointed out, is just kind of the tip of the iceberg with more debt there. Let's say the really worst case scenario is there's some sort of debt crisis in China. How does that affect the United States? Well, there's a direct way, and that is, if there's a debt crisis in China, the Chinese economy is going to slow down very sharply, if not start to contract. And right now, we send about $120 billion of exports to China. Okay, now that's a big number, right? But keep in mind, we're a $23 trillion economy. So it's less than 0.5% of GDP. So, in some sense, it's not that big of a deal. Now, China is the second largest economy in the world, and if it were to go down the tubes, it would also cause a lot of economic pain elsewhere. And so, that 0.5% of GDP that I talked about, in reality, probably would be bigger than that, because you would see export growth slow, if not go into reverse, in some other sorts of countries, around the world as well. So it certainly would have an economic slowing effect on the United States. Whether or not it would put the U.S. back in recession is an open question. It depends on how big it is. But I think it would have to be a really big problem or a big crisis to put the U.S. economy back into recession through these economic channels that I just discussed.
Great. So you spoke to the economic impact. What I'm also wanting to know is, is there any financial market implications from this? We talked a little bit about volatility being a little bit elevated this year. Can you talk a little bit more about the financial effects that have stemmed from the Evergrande crisis this week?
Yeah, so we'd certainly be remiss if we didn't talk about the financial markets effect, right? I mean, we already saw the stock market weaken on that, and that gets a lot of people's attention. And as you pointed out, we've stabilized and have moved higher subsequent to that. But I think what's a little bit more potentially more concerning is what would it do to the corporate bond market? And so, if you look back at other periods in the recent history of financial stress, so, if you go back to the financial crisis, what you saw is bond spreads and the corporate market, really blew out. It happened again about a year ago or so when the economy locked down here. We just got this, blowing out in terms of corporate spreads. And when that happens, what that shows is, the borrowing cost for many corporations jumps. When that happened. And we saw it earlier this week to a much smaller extent, but we did see corporate bond spreads widen. Now, if Evergrande were to become more systemic, if you were to have a debt crisis in China, I would think you would see a lot of stress in the corporate bond markets here in the United States, and that acts as a real financial tightening. If corporations have to pay up more and more money to borrow money, then it's a real financial tightening here. So, again, at this point, things seem to have stabilized. I think our view, I know, Brendan, I think your view is the situation in China is largely manageable at this point. But this certainly is a story that we'll be keeping our eye on. And as things develop and as our thoughts evolve here, we'll certainly keep you up to date. Thank you again for joining us today.